Welcome to the Podcast for Inquiry, brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada, a national educational charity supporting your community for reason, compassion, and secular humanist values. You have answers, we have questions. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblood, board member and secular chair for CFIC. Welcome. I speak with Russell today about the philosophical principle of liberalism. We start with a definition of liberalism and how it emerged over the past few centuries, and we delve deeply into two of its core concepts, free speech and toleration. We also discuss how group dynamics can lead to polarization and how we can strive to return to liberal values. I'm very proud to bring you my conversation with Russell Blackford. Russell Blackford, it's my pleasure to welcome you today on Podcast for Inquiry.
Thanks for having me, Leslie. Glad to meet you, and I'm glad to be here.
I want to talk to you about your two most recent books, The Tyranny of Opinion and primarily How We Became Post-Liberal. Now, I think before we get into the content of the book, we need to understand what liberal means. I know that the Liberal Party is a mainstream party in Canada. It's also a mainstream party, although with different politics, in Australia. It's generally used as an epithet in the United States. Neoliberalism is a political doctrine espousing unfettered markets. So when you say how we became post-liberal, can you start by defining what you mean by liberal in this context?
Yes, the trouble with the word is it means all sorts of different things in different countries. But historically, liberalism is a political tendency, you might say, in which a high value is placed on individual liberty and freedom of speech in particular. That's the kind of thing that I'm talking about. I'm talking about a tendency in politics to value social pluralism, individual liberty, freedoms and principles such as the rule of law, and particularly freedom of inquiry and speech.
Okay, and there's an implication if we are now post-liberal that once we were liberal. So certainly freedom of speech and individual freedom is not something that characterizes most of human history. So at what point did we emerge from, I guess, pre-liberal or a not liberal social organization to at least something that you would consider liberal until we get to today in a post-liberal world? Can you give us a timeline on these ideas?
I think we might have bypassed a time when we're never truly liberal. I don't know that ever actually happened. But liberal ideas had a certain prestige in, say, the 1960s. And they no longer seem to have that prestige even on the left. So going way back, of course, I trace way back to classical antiquity and to other civilizations, such as the civilization of China and India in the book. But then I move into more modern European history, which was, of course, dominated historically by Christianity. Christianity, when it rose to power in the late period of antiquity, in, say, the 4th century AD, quickly established itself as a very intolerant religion, right? And there are reasons for that. If you don't believe the right things, you end up being spiritually damned in the afterlife. You also undermine the authority of the church, which is there saving souls, and so on. So Christianity, in a very brief way to summarise the account, could not really tolerate dissent from the orthodox doctrines. And we have a whole history of Christianity persecuting the remaining pagans, including pagan philosophers, persecuting Jews, persecuting people who were seen as heretics, persecuting atheists. It became a persecutorial religion. Whatever its upside may have been historically, Christianity had a big downside. We start to see a reaction to that in about the 16th and 17th centuries, arising from the Protestant Reformation. Now, that's not because the Protestants were more tolerant than the Catholics. It's because neither could tolerate each other, and indeed they couldn't even tolerate, subsets of themselves.
Right.
Protestants
There
would
were
not
there were
necessarily tolerate other Protestants.
so many wars of religion between Christians and Protestants throughout European history.
Right. We see the French Wars of Religion, the 30 Years' War. We see people being burned at the stake, and so on. And that led to some reaction. You start seeing people saying, this can't go on. We need to find ways of tolerating each other. And out of that, there's a rich body of work by people like John Locke, for example, who was writing in the late 17th century and proved to be very influential on constitutional history in the US, very influential on the US Constitution and the Bill of Rights. For example, people like Madison and Jefferson in the US were influenced by Locke. And within that stream of thought, you start to get this idea that the church and the state have very different functions. And it's not really the role of the state to enforce the church's morality or to enforce whatever is needed to conduce to the salvation of souls. Locke says, the purpose of the state is to protect the things of this world, not to protect whatever benefit or otherwise you might receive, in the next world, in an afterlife or in some transcendent world. That's the point we start to reach during the 17th century. And then, of course, we get the Enlightenment in the 18th century. And a lot of what we now call liberal ideas start bubbling up. Ideas to do with greater freedom of speech, ideas to do with the rule of law, whereby arbitrary state power is curtailed. The state can't just can't just lock you up in jail or kill you because you're a heretic. It can only act according to the ideas of the rule of law if it's acting in accordance with pre-existing law. So, for example, you can't be called a criminal, made a criminal by the state, unless there's actually a criminal law already there, which you have breached, and there's a proper trial with due process, and you are then convicted through that process. That's the rule of law as it applies to criminal cases. So that's a liberal principle, as we'd now call it, that really only arises in any recognisable form in the 18th century. We start seeing French thinkers such as Montesquieu, the Baron de Montesquieu, coming out with those sorts of ideas. Now, at that stage, nobody called themselves liberals. The term liberal really only arises in the early 19th century, but we see the French Revolution in the latter part of the 18th century. That, of course, all goes wrong. We have the terror with Robespierre, a whole lot of mess. But by the early 19th century, we have people who are starting to call themselves liberals, initially in Spain, who are picking up on the ideas of the French Revolution and the Enlightenment and developing a philosophy or a political tendency. Philosophy might be too strong, which we now call liberalism. And so liberalism has emerged as of the early part of the 19th century. It takes many forms across Europe. It's not a term that's really being used in, say, the US, incidentally. The US only picked it up much later. But similar ideas are going on in the US, of course. Through the 18th century, liberalism goes through various kinds of changes. Liberalism in the UK is really something that starts to take form somewhat later than on the continent, in, say, the 1830s and moving through. We see important thinkers like John Stuart Mill, who wrote on liberty, which was published in 1859, and is, to some extent, the closest thing to a Bible that that liberal thinkers have.
I have a bit of a confession to make. I throughout my teens and 20s and even into my 30s, I disparaged philosophy and thought that it was just a bunch of people making like sandcastles in the air, and it was just had no relationship to reality. It was just a figment of someone's imagination. They delved really deep, and I just dismissed it all out of hand. And I regret that now. But that was it's one of it was a terrible mistake, and I see the error of my ways, and I came to that realization fairly late in life. But having read a little bit of Mill now, and referenced you reference him often in your book, and I'm like, I love this guy. Like, I think in many ways I have been channeling him and a lot of his thoughts and ideas in developing my own thoughts on secularism and on rule of law, and on how society should be formed. And if anyone who believes in the same ideals that I do and that we do at the Center for Inquiry Canada, reason, compassion, secular values, starting with Mill is a good idea. And thank you for essentially bringing him to my attention, and expanding my education to a fair extent.
And of course, Mill's building on people like Locke and the philosophers of the French Enlightenment,
Yeah,
people like
we all
Montesquieu.
stand on the shoulders of giants.
Right, right. Although sometimes we might fall off, and in part the book's about that because it's subtitled, The Rise and Fall of Toleration. Mill is saying all sorts of behaviour and speech should be tolerated, right? Even if you don't agree with it, you should tolerate it. And the bar for either legal suppression or social suppression. He's not just talking about what the government does. The bar for legal or social suppression of other people's behaviour should be a pretty high bar to get over. And he has this principle, the harm principle. You leave people alone, let them live their lives how they want, unless they're doing harm to others. And harm here is a pretty narrow concept. These days the word harm seems to have had an inflated meaning. Anything can now be called harmful. If something makes someone feel uncomfortable, that's said to be harmful by a lot of people. I'm sure you've seen this. I'm sure a lot of our viewers have seen this concept.
I definitely want to come back. I want to talk about that, but we'll come back to that a little bit later today.
But for Mill, it's clearly a pretty high bar. He's thinking of harm in a pretty strong sense, although he never defines it, and it's hard to define. But we have an intuitive idea of what harm means in that strong sense. And it's really got to be harm to somebody else, not some harm that you decided to bring on yourself, or a risk that you decided to take. It's not a harm in some sense of you've harmed someone's morality, you've corrupted them. It's harm to others, and it's got to be some sort of significant harm. Harm in some intuitively quite strong sense. And otherwise, you let people alone to live their lives, and take the risk that they choose to take. It may be fine to be more paternalistic toward children, say, or people who have some cognitive problem, but by and large, if we're talking about mature adults, with their full cognitive powers, you let them live their lives, and you might find that what they're doing, even though you might not have found value in it yourself, there might be value in it for others. It might turn out that experiments in living, as Mill says, actually have some value, and that new ideas have some value. Even bad ideas might have some value because they might at least enable you to clarify your own ideas when you come to grips with them. So, in a nutshell, that's the kind of philosophy, the kind of encapsulation of the liberal trend to that time that's been put forward in Mill's On Liberty. And that's a book that I go back to again and again. It means a lot to my thinking. And as you'll have seen if you've read The Tyranny of Opinion, as you were saying, I spent a lot of time kind of unpacking what Mill's saying and why and what it might mean for us today. So that's that liberal tendency coming through, which attains a lot of prestige going through the 19th century and into, say, the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s. But then it starts somewhere around there to lose prestige, to answer your question.
Right. So, I think we'll pick it up at the 1970s in a couple of minutes. But I wanted to. You mentioned that one of the main reasons that it took so long for the liberal ideas to come to the fore was at least in Europe, the predominance of the Catholic or the Christian Church. And you write, and I'm just going to quote a line from you: while the liberal framework or some version of it might provide the rudiments of a fighting faith, liberals can seem ill-equipped to defend their central ideas in contest with more dogmatic opponents. And I have certainly encountered a number of dogmatic opponents to what I
Yeah.
consider to be liberal ideas, but I haven't really I haven't found the same challenge that you're alluding to here. So I'm hoping
Oh,
that you
okay.
can expand on why you think that liberals might be challenged when trying to deal with uh, genuine, sincere, fundamentalist believers.
Oh, the idea there is really just that liberals want to tolerate even what they disagree with, right? Whereas opponents often don't feel that way. If you're dealing with people who are dogmatic and who think there's a lot at stake,
Mhm.
those people may well not be prepared to countenance disagreement. Whereas liberals want to hear disagreement. Liberals want to find, well, what might be the grain of truth in what my opponent's saying? Or might it even turn out that there's more than a grain of truth? Now, that can make for interesting discussions, but it can also lead to toleration of things that maybe shouldn't even be tolerated. There becomes a quite difficult question of just when do you stop tolerating the intolerant? Now, by and large, we try to tolerate as much as possible if we're working within that liberal framework. But yeah, there can come times. Do we tolerate Nazis? Do we tolerate terrorists? Where do we start drawing lines? And some of these questions, didn't really arise for Mill. Some of it arises from, some of the terrible events of the 20th century, which will doubtless, which doubtless have continued and will continue in various forms.
So yeah, you mentioned that and that one of the core tenets of liberalism is commitment to free speech and to make that as maximal as possible. But I am not. I'm certainly by default free speech. I'm pro free speech. I defend this
Mm,
principle,
mm,
but I am not a free speech absolutist. I have always believed that there are legitimate and appropriate restrictions on completely unfettered speech, whether
right.
it be uttering death threats, fraud or impersonation, um, uh, um, limited and well crafted libel or slander laws. These are all, in my opinion, quite legitimate restrictions on free speech. Uh, and you also say that the only limits should be whatever is needed to protect the rights or the common security of others. So that's fine, I guess, in terms of like a broad uh, principle. But where do you, if we're talking about how to structure society, if we're talking about laws, even if we're talking about norms within a culture, there have to be lines that are drawn. Something is
Yeah.
legal, something is appropriate, something else is not. How do you take these very broad principles that I've just outlined, that and I think I'm accurately summarizing what you wrote in your book, and bring that down to okay, but there are no-go zones, and so where do we delineate them, and how do we keep them as small as necessary without encompassing everything?
I think there are genuine difficulties at the margins here. I don't have a magic formula that I can draw the line in exactly a particular place. I think there are genuine arguments about that line. Not all of the cases are the same, though. Even Mill has this idea that in some cases, the speech that's going on may incite immediate violence, right? He has, for example, the famous corn dealer case. The free market in corn was a huge issue back in the 1850s in the UK. And he's imagining there's an angry mob gathered outside the house of a corn dealer. And there's a demagogue standing in front of the house, waving his arms and saying, corn dealers are starvers of the poor. Now, in those circumstances, that might actually start a riot. It might start violence. They might invade the corn dealer's house. That's where Mill draws a line. Incitement to immediate violence uh, is a way of describing the line that Mill's describing there. And even US law, even the most absolutist free speech supporters in the US uh, agree that incitement to immediate violence, that's actually likely to happen in the circumstances. That is a line that even they would draw. That's one line. As for defamation, if you're actually telling lies about people that are going to ruin their lives, that's not the kind of thing. And say you do it knowingly. Mill would not say that falls under what he's defending. He's defending freedom to hold opinions on general topics of morality and science and philosophy, theology, whatever it might be, those topics of general interest, politics. He's saying that we should be permitting all opinions, and we should, in fact, be even, thinking about whether those opinions may have, some truth to them. But that's different from singling out an individual and saying, such and such a person is a pedophile.
Right.
Just to try to destroy that person. That's not what Mill's talking about at all. That's not what I'm talking about. So that kind of line can be drawn. Now, exactly what how reckless you have to be, whether it makes a difference if the person's a politician. There are issues like that. But generally speaking, you can draw a line where that kind of destructive lie about an individual, can be stopped by law. And Mill would totally agree. Mill was not in favour of defamation at all. He was in favour of free inquiry into a whole range of topics and free expression of the opinions that arise from inquiry and discussion of those opinions. Now, there are still some kinds of lines that we could talk about. What if someone goes on the radio? This happened in Rwanda. People go on the radio, people with a big audience, government backing, all sorts of things, and they say the Tutsis are snakes and cockroaches, go out and exterminate them, right? Well, I think there's a pretty good basis for drawing a line there at all. Mill's not talking about trying to incite people to, go and kill others. Now, he didn't have the radio, of course. In his corn dealer example, he's talking about, immediate violence actually there, geographically on the spot. But I think in modern times we can extend that. Mm-hmm. And we can say, well, okay, if you're doing that kind of thing on the radio, you're trying to incite genocide. Well, again, that seems like a line that we can draw to say that kind of speech is intolerable. I mean, there's a case in the US where in circumstances where it's meant to intimidate, not some private circumstance that no one would know about unless they sort of invaded it with a camera, but a burning cross, a Ku Klux Klan burning cross to intimidate black people in the local area. That kind of intimidation of people, which can be a prelude to violence as well as a threat of violence, that again is not the kind of thing that Mill's talking about. We can draw all sorts of lines like that. Where it gets harder is where somebody is putting, say, a political point of view that may, by an indirect process, lead to violence. Somebody might be saying, let's have a revolution and overthrow democracy. Should that be allowed? Well, I would actually allow it. But there's a lot of law in Europe and in the US, and I expect in Canada, although I can't think of what the Canadian case law might be on this, you could tell me. But, there's a lot of case law on where exactly one draws the line there. Mill would want to tolerate as much as possible if there's no... I mean, he would say the claim that, the corn dealers are starvers of the poor, might be fine if it's just in a newspaper. Someone writes an inflammatory op-ed in a newspaper. It's where, real violence might arise that he's going to object to it. So, look, a lot of speech that people say is hate speech or is too inflammatory to tolerate, etc., I would say comes nowhere near those lines. Yeah. But exactly where you draw the lines is a difficult matter, and I think there can be reasonable disagreement about it.
In Canada, our freedom of expression is enshrined in our Constitution, which is called the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and it's subject really only to those limitations that are reasonable in a free and democratic society. So that's and then of course the job becomes, what is a reasonable restriction in a free and democratic society, and
Right.
that's sort of the
And
foundation
I have read some of
of.
I have read some of the hate speech
Mhm.
cases in Canada. There's some very interesting and useful cases about hate speech and what is hate out of the Canadian case law. But I can't say I'm familiar with the Canadian case law to the extent I am with some of the other
I
jurisdictions.
want to talk about some of the cases you mentioned earlier about concept creep. So I think we're both agreed that restrictions on speech are reasonable, or like in principle, that there should be restrictions on certain types of speech. And I think we are also both agreed that we would like them, you and I, that is, to be as limited as possible, to be as narrow and as is required
Right.
for maintenance of a healthy society. But you cite an example in your book of the city of St. Paul in 1990. And this contained a prohibition on placing symbols that could reasonably be known to cause anger, alarm, or resentment in others on the basis of race, color, creed, religion, or gender. And I read that and I thought, this strikes me as a terrible law because
Right.
it what it does is it incentivizes people to react strongly. So if I say I don't like this thing that somebody said, well, people will just shrug and say, well, that's your right. You don't have to like it, but no one's going to do anything about it. But if this law is in place and instead of saying I don't like it, I become incensed and I become angry and I just throw essentially an adult temper tantrum. Maybe I break some windows or something because it's just
Mm.
so terrible what this person said. Suddenly the other person has broken the law because they've aroused anger, alarm, and resentment in me. And that's what the law says. And so this law kind of incentivizes not reasonable disputation or disagreement, but uh, uh, but a more extreme reaction, and in a sense really could encourage violence just so that I can make the speech that I don't like illegal. Is that was that like your intention? Is that what you were thinking when you included that example in your book?
Right. Well, that yeah. I mean that law, as you know, was struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court, and it was written in a way that could capture all sorts of speech. Now, it may be that it captured some speech that I would think should be should be banned, but it could also catch a whole lot of other speech that just makes people feel annoyed, upset, etc., as you say. And I agree with you that a lot of the rhetoric that goes on, both within the legal system, the laws that get enacted, but also just social activism and political activism, do have that tendency of pushing people into claiming that they are angered, they're outraged, they're upset, they're traumatized by speech, which may only be speech that they
Mhm.
disagree with. Or, you know, we've had these cases in the US where speakers have gone onto university campuses, to put some view that's locally unpopular, but should clearly fall well within social and legal toleration. And yet there are students on campus claiming to be so traumatised by it that they have to have a safe room that they can go to, where they can, pet, pet cute animals or whatever it might be. And there are violent demonstrations against these people on the other hand. And it's really just speech. It's really just someone putting an opinion, something that would fall well within the other kind of concepts, of free inquiry and opinion and discussion that we've been talking about. It's not intimidating somebody. It's not calling for someone's life to be destroyed with some false claim that they're a pedophile or a Nazi, or whatever it might be. It's nothing like that. Just someone, expressing an opinion that others find upsetting, or look, they seem to be genuinely upset in some of these cases, in fact, when you might think, well, why does it go beyond disagreement into this feeling of being upset and traumatized and so on? But there actually seems to be an incentive now to start feeling that way, as you've been
Yeah.
suggesting.
So, like to take like one specific example rather than speaking entirely in the abstract, like there are people who are opposed to equal marriage between two men being married or two women being married.
Okay.
And I'm fully in favor of it, but there are those that are not, and I think they have the right to. I think they have the right to say that it's not appropriate for society to give its endorsement implicitly or explicitly to that, or that's not what the purpose of marriage is supposed to be. I think they're wrong, and I'll tell them
Right.
why. But what I've heard from some of my gay friends is like what they hear when they say that is that they're saying I shouldn't exist, that my same sex spouse
Right.
is illegitimate, and how is that not a call for them to be erased from their standing in society? And I and I'm just wondering what your response is to people who. I mean, I'm going to assume that you would say that someone standing up that says two men should not get married and they should not be recognized by the state as spouses. I'm going to assume two things: one, that you would disagree with that statement, and two, that you would agree that that person has the right to say those words. So, what would you say to somebody
Okay.
who is like genuinely hurt and perhaps fearful or and as of the implications of that sort of statement?
Yeah. Okay, going back to your presumptions, we actually voted on the issue of same-sex marriage here in Australia a few years ago, and the vote was that we should introduce it. So I think the figures were, I think over 60% of people actually voted in favour. It was quite a
Yeah, but that
strong
means
vote.
roughly
I think it was actually
a
better than
third or so of
60-40.
Australians
So
are against it, or at least were at the time.
yeah, that's right. The figures are something like that, something like 2/3 to 1/3. Don't hold me to the precise numbers, but something like that. It was a pretty strong vote in favour, and I voted in favour. So that's the first thing. You can make that assumption. But yes, there were people here who argued against it because of their concept of marriage. Some doubtless, although they didn't really put it this way, some doubtless thought that homosexual encounters are sinful, that they don't conduce to spiritual salvation in the afterlife. This kind of thing that good evangelical Christians still worry about. Some would have had that in their minds. Others just thought the concept of marriage was being changed here. Some, a very small number, even took the view that, well, marriage isn't a good thing anyway. Why do we want to extend it to the gay people? And some gay
Sure.
people take that view. That is a view that's around, and in fact, it's a view that I once held many years ago, but I've kind of got beyond that view now. I mean, the gay community wants it. Who am I to
Yeah.
stand in the way of it? And I think indeed that the way marriage has changed, the nature of marriage has changed over the past maybe 150 years, and certainly over the last 50 years. I don't think it makes sense anymore to not provide the possibility of marriage to gay couples, to gay men or lesbians who want to have that institution available to them. So that's my position, and that's the kind of argument that took place in Australia, and it led
But
to a certain outcome. But what about the people who disagree with me? That's your
yeah,
question.
yeah,
I'm being
yeah,
a bit
yeah. So,
rambly.
so
uh, I think they have a right to their position. That's my short view. They have a right to express it and to put their arguments. And I don't think that erases anybody. I mean, if you say, you say marriage is there primarily as a way of ensuring that children, you have two parents or something. Now, that might not be an argument that I go along with, but if you actually believe that that's what marriage is all about, and you think therefore it should not be available to gay or lesbian couples, it doesn't make sense for that institution to apply for them, I don't see how that erases gay or lesbian couples. There is a difference there. They can adopt children, of course, or they can have children through some surrogacy arrangement. There are ways, obviously, that they can have children. But there is a difference, and you can argue that point. Look, you can even say, point blank, same-sex encounters are sinful, and God dislikes them, and they're one of the many things that will, put you in danger of hellfire. Now, that is a view that I find totally repugnant, of course. But if people aren't allowed to put that view, freedom of religion has basically gone. You've got to allow people to put traditional liberal views, no matter how repugnant you and I'm sure you find it as repugnant as I do. But I think even that view, should not be suppressed in our society. We shouldn't have laws saying you cannot preach that view, or if you put that view, your employer can fire you. Which became an issue here in Australia. That view should be permitted. But it's a view I'd argue very strongly against, of course. As I say, it's a view that I find repugnant and intellectually untenable. But if people believe their religion, they've had some sort of experience that makes them trust the church or makes them trust the Bible or whatever it is, or they've had a born again experience and they implicitly trust the local preacher. Whatever it is, if you start making it illegal for them to hold the views that result from that, you are in a very liberal place.
But it would seem that I'm wanting to find something to disagree with you on, but I'm I'm finding that I am agreeing with you. But it does seem that we're headed to a very illiberal place. I guess that's why you've titled your book "We Are in a Post-Liberal World." You mentioned the European Court of Human Rights, and you say that according to the court's jurisprudence, the right not to have feelings hurt can impose a positive obligation on the state to restrict freedom of expression granted in Article 10 of the European Human Rights Code. Right. And I read that and I found it alarming because if I can restrict speech by claiming that my feelings have been hurt, then the most sensitive members of society will become the censors, and that will include up to bad faith interpretations of anything with even a shred of ambiguity. And doesn't that kind of hand the reins of defining what acceptable speech is to the most sensitive, or perhaps to the sociopaths willing to claim the greatest offense for the greatest hurt feelings on the smallest offense?
Yeah, these cases in Europe often involve speech that could be considered blasphemy, either strictly speaking or some loose sense. Speech that somehow is seen to mock
blasphemy is the ultimate of victimless crimes.
But it hurts people's feelings, right? So you get some of these cases in Austria and Poland and the UK, where people said, well, we can't tolerate certain kinds of speech, certain videos or certain statements that people have made, or because it just hurts religious feelings.
And is that given a separate category? Like hurting religious feelings is different than hurting one's feelings in another aspect of one's identity?
Well, under the laws of some of these countries, it is, yeah, and it's certainly an issue that's recognised by the European Court of Human Rights. So they've tried to draw lines, and it's often hard to see what principled line they're really drawing. For example, there's a case, a quite recent case, involving a Polish pop singer known as Doda, who had some kind of flip things to say, making fun of religion, and she was dragged up before the Polish courts and and fined, and she took it to the European Court of Human Rights, and she was successful. It seems that in that case, the European Court thought, oh well, this is all a bit lightweight, really. The Polish courts haven't kind of weighed up the totality of the circumstances. We think she should have been allowed to say that. But in cases where it seems to be something a bit more intense than that, they have actually upheld some of the national cases where people have been punished for what amounts to blasphemy or something like blasphemy, because of the hurt to religious feelings. So I think that's a worrying development in Europe, but it's one that's been going on for quite a long time now.
Yeah, I would agree. Because again, just because it leads to a perverse set of incentives where the smaller and smaller transgressions against piety leads to a bigger and bigger response, which means that more and more becomes off limits from at least a legal speech
Yes.
perspective.
But it does cut in more than one direction. You know, that the people whose religious feelings are hurt, as they say, may feel genuine upset in much the same way as the example you were giving of a gay man, let's say, who's upset by someone opposing same-sex marriage. Now, all sorts of people, for all sorts of reasons, can be upset by speech. Now, they may not be having their lives destroyed by speech because damaging lies are being told about them. They may not be being intimidated by speech that suggests the prospect of violence or threatens violence toward them. They don't come to those sorts of categories, but their feelings are genuinely hurt. So the question is, do we draw a line at that point? And I would say that's a dangerous line to draw.
I want to talk about something related to that. You quote a British politician, Baroness Warsi. I might be mispronouncing her name. Uh, and, and you say that she rejects any serious criticism of Islam or Islamic culture as based on hatred and bigotry. Intellectual arguments are dismissed without a hearing, and I've noticed this too, where any criticism, for example, of Islam, and you're accused of Islamophobia. Regardless, it
Mm.
doesn't matter what you said. It's like
Mm.
a blanket get out of jail free card. You play that, or if I'm going to use the example, even though right now it's particularly charged, but even before October 7th, any criticism of Israel, regardless of the merits of the critique, was just dismissed out of hand as being anti-Semitic. And I've noticed that, and I haven't found a way to counter that technique effectively. And I'm wondering if you have any insights into how you can essentially force a conversation, or force a not force. That's a poor choice of terms. But how you can ensure that a conversation, that an argument is engaged on the merits and not dismissed out of hand. And if there's a way to counter that rhetorical technique that just says, "Bah, I don't even have to talk to you about it. You are being irrational in your criticism."
Yeah. Look, I think when you're dealing with individuals one on one, you have no guarantee that it's possible to do that. There are all sorts of suggestions. Peter Boghossian and James Lindsay, have their book How to Have Impossible Conversations, in which they offer all sorts of tips for how to try to have conversations across deep moral and political divides. But even they would say, sometimes you just have to drop it and walk away. You may have made some point that could get the other person, when they walk away, they may have a seed of doubt in their mind. That may be all you can do. Or you may not even be able to do that. It's often just not possible because you're dealing with people who just are dogmatic and who may be very upset by any challenge to their views. And you've got to know when to make that judgment and maybe say something and walk away, or maybe not even say anything and walk away. I wouldn't be advising anyone to really press the issue against that kind of opposition. What I think is more important, at least from my point of view, is to try to get make my small contribution to trying to get a society where it's more accepted that the truth even of things like religious documents, religious doctrines and dogmas is open to discussion and criticism. We seem to be losing the idea that the views viewed as correct by some people who care a lot about them, I think a lot's at stake. We seem to be losing the view that it's okay nonetheless to criticise those ideas.
You mentioned earlier the the idea of concept creep. And in your book, you define violence as signifying the damaging infliction of physical force against people or other living creatures or non-living things. And I think that's a reasonable definition. But as I read it, even as I agreed with it, it seemed quaint. When I think of when I think of protests that I've seen, often when causes that I support or that I'm in favor of, I hear the slogan. I've heard the slogan a lot, particularly in the last 5 years, that silence is violence. Meaning that if you're not with us and vocally supporting what we're marching for, it is, you are committing an act of violence against us. And I've also heard it vociferously argued that offensive speech is exactly the same, equally harmful as a physical assault. There are no degrees between them. And I don't think that that's correct, but I'm wondering if you have any insights of how we got to this level of concept creep, and how we might be able to distinguish
Yeah,
between
yeah.
someone uh, insulting you, someone hurting your feelings, someone saying something truly vile, and breaking your nose with their fist.
Well, the distinction in that case is pretty clear. And one involves
Sure, but
physical
but
force, and
the
maybe
argument is
being
that
physically
your
damaged.
offensive
So,
speech is exactly the same as physical violence. It's
yeah. But I suppose I'm making it's
or
not exactly the same. What
equally.
they what I mean, I can't claim it's
Yes, I'm
but
sorry. Yes,
it's
that's a
equally
better way to
bad,
put
is
it.
what
Thank
they're
you.
saying, right? Yeah, yeah. But I'm not meaning to quibble though. But that distinction in itself is important. They can't really say that it's exactly the same. That literally is violence, even though you'll hear the term literal violence. You hear all these abstractions preceded by the word literal, literal fascism, literal Nazism, literal violence. But often it's not literal any of those things. Now, whatever it is might be something bad, and you can look at whatever it is, and you can look at whether that bad thing is a thing that we should tolerate, because we do need to tolerate a lot of things that are objectionable, or we're going to be going around with a society that's where we're continually crushing all sorts of behaviour and speech, and we're going to end up with a war of all against all. We need some level of toleration. Liberals like me would say we need a very high level of toleration. I'm trying to think of concrete examples. You know, with Israel, you brought up Israel. I've long had a worry that people get charged with being anti-Semitic merely because they've criticised Israel's foreign policy. And you see some definitions of anti-Semitism. There are some high-profile definitions that have been picked up by various governments, corporations, universities, powerful institutions, that embrace those kinds of definitions, where any sort of very unreasonable, let's say, criticism of Israel counts as being anti-Semitic. Well, that's not what anti-Semitism is, really. It had an historical meaning, originally in Germany, and it has a modern meaning, and that modern meaning
Mm-hmm.
really is hatred of Jews. Now, you can criticise Israel pretty harshly and even unreasonably, because people often are unreasonable, without actually hating Jews. Hating Jews, which means wanting to harm Jews, and being prepared to take opportunities to harm Jews. That's something that goes beyond thinking that Netanyahu's policies, let's say, are bad policies, and the way they're affected as damaging, or anything like that. Even if it turns out that some of those criticisms are not really fair. So that is an example. But of course, there are plenty of examples on the other side of politics as well. I should say, some of what we're seeing at the moment really is anti-Semitic. We've had demonstrations here in Australia where people were a minority, but a minority at those demonstrations have
Mm-hmm.
chanted, "Gas the Jews," right? I mean, that clearly is anti-Semitic. Now, in between, there are people chanting "From the river to the sea," whatever that means. It's very
I read a
disputable.
survey that, at least in North America, They interviewed or they surveyed a group of people who were attending a pro-Palestinian rally, and over half of the
Right.
attendees couldn't name which river and which sea. So they
Right.
clearly don't. I mean, I don't
Right.
know what. Maybe it
Yeah.
just it rhymes, so they said it, but they don't know what it means, or at least like a majority, or at least half of the people don't know what it means.
And some of them just think what that geographical area, whatever it is, that happens to be between the Jordan and the Mediterranean, they think there's a lot of unfreedom for Palestinians there. Israel's being nasty, and they should be not. They might just think something very vague like that, but there is this meaning that it has, that it's historically had, and which I think the hardliners really do mean, which is destroy the state of Israel, right? And when you destroy the state of Israel, that land will be swallowed up into something else, which will presumably be ruled by some organisation like Hamas itself, or some larger organisation. And that organisation is going inevitably to end up running something like the theocratic dictatorship that we have in Iran. I mean, I think that is the tendency of that chant, from the river to the sea. But that's not necessarily what people consciously mean by it when they're chanting it. And so I don't want to ban that chant. I don't think that the people chanting it are necessarily motivated by hatred of Jews. I don't think they're inciting immediate violence against Jews. I do think, though, that they are contributing to an atmosphere where real anti-Semitic people, you know, are turning violent. There is a problem of real anti-Semitism around, and I think we now have a quite difficult policy issue. I did think that congressional hearing in the US recently, where 3 university presidents were being grilled by members of Congress, yeah, that went
I
very
remember that.
badly.
We're recording this in mid-December, and this was just 2 weeks ago,
Yeah,
earlier this month.
right. Yeah, sorry, your listeners don't necessarily know when we're talking, but yes, today's the 20th of December, my time. Uh,
Right. Yeah, and this will be released in early January.
okay, okay. Look, I thought that the questioning of those 3 people was pretty outrageous. You know, they're basically being berated. They're being treated in a way that even the most hostile cross-examining trial attorney or barrister would not be allowed to treat a witness in court. You know, the tests were made to put words into their mouth. They were not given any opportunity to explain themselves. And I thought it went pretty badly, whatever criticisms you can make of those 3 university presidents. But it shows again, you know, the difficulty of this particular issue, because I'm sure there is some real anti-Semitism on those campuses. I don't know if anyone's literally chanting "Gas the Jews," and I certainly wouldn't want that being said. That is a call for violence, right? From the river to the sea, if that was being taken as in itself an expression of genocidal intent, that's starting to draw a long bow, because, as you say, that a lot of these people, these demonstrations, don't even know which river and which sea they're talking about. They may have no idea what that phrase, you know, really means, or what it's conveying in the context. It starts to get very murky indeed.
So we've talked a lot about free speech, but you mentioned that another key principle of liberalism is toleration. I'd like to talk a little bit about that. And you write that tolerance today is often regarded as a vice. And I'd like you to expand on that and why, like what you see that makes you write that, and why, in the view of those that support that hold that view, why they think that tolerance is a bad thing.
But I think it's a bad thing, because in tolerating, you're objecting. You know, if I say I'm tolerating something, it means I have some objection to it. Uh, you know, it may irritate me,
Mm-hmm.
or I may think that some view is wrong, or whatever my objection may be. There's different kinds of objections that you can have to things, but just saying you object to it, and that you are somehow entitled to object to it, but you're going to put up with it. Now, no one really wants that. People, by and large, don't want others putting up with them. What they want is to be liked, to be welcomed, to be appreciated. Okay, so so yeah, I can understand why people don't want to be tolerated. They want to be appreciated. They want to be welcomed. Nonetheless, there are all sorts of circumstances where people just do have objections. They might even be moral objections. They might be objections that they are quite capable of, of justifying through argument. But nonetheless, they also have reasons why, despite those objections, they will show forbearance. They will put up with whatever it is they're objecting to. And very often that's I would say, the right thing for them to do. Yeah, maintain your objection, but don't try to suppress this view that you object to, or to harm this person who's doing something that you object to. There's a great deal to be said in any society for being as tolerant as possible, rather than going nuclear on everything that you object to, by trying to pass laws against it, or trying to harm people, or whatever it might be. And the result of that is, even though we don't want to be tolerated, we want to be appreciated. Toleration really is something that socially is very beneficial. And liberals like me, again, will say, we should tolerate as much of what we object to as we can. If we don't do that, it leads to all sorts of trouble.
If we are to live in a pluralistic society where people from perhaps not all walks of life, but at least many walks of life coexist within a community, if you've got a wide range of people, there are going to be those that disagree on that hold opposite views on some pretty core principles. Without a modicum of toleration, it seems to me that that's a recipe for strife. Either there's going to be a tremendous amount of social discord, or there'll be an attempt to homogenize society. So, is there an alternative to toleration in where people hold a wide range of views on like every subject imaginable?
Well, I think that the alternative is what we're seeing, because we have seen this trajectory of the fall of toleration. The book is subtitled "The Rise and Fall of Toleration," and the trajectory is, we see people from all sorts of moral and political positions not wanting to tolerate each other, wanting to take all sorts of steps to harm those who they object to. So they will try to enact laws to ban certain points of view being put forward. They will try to pressure employers to to fire people who've put views that they dislike. They will simply try to shut down views that they don't like. They'll resort sometimes to violence. And we see this ongoing heightening of the disagreement, so that it even carries over into violence. We seem to be seeing that kind of polarization, that kind of hardening of attitudes more and more. And it's not from one particular side of politics. I'm very critical of the way the political left has transformed itself over the past 30 to 50 years. But we get a backlash from the political right, which is just as worrying, if not more so. The anti-woke movement that we seem to have now worries me as much as the excesses of the social justice movement. Both of those worry me. And there are traditional ideas. There are traditional Christians, for example, who are not prepared to tolerate all sorts of things. And if they had their way, they would ban all sorts of things. They'd ban abortion. They wouldn't have same-sex marriage anymore. They might actually reenact laws against homosexuality and all sorts of other things, no doubt. So that's a whole range of groups in our society that don't really want to be tolerant. They're not prepared to show forbearance in respect of what they disagree with. And that's the alternative. The alternative is more and more of that lack of forbearance, more and more of that of people just being at each other's
You
throats.
describe what I found was a fascinating transition in your book. You wrote that politically aware young Muslims went from campaigning against nightclubs that excluded Muslims to campaigning to prevent young Muslims from going to nightclubs. And can you get into that a little bit more? Because that's almost a complete 180-degree turn, and I'm fascinated to know what led from the former to the latter in that case.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I should say I was quoting somebody else in saying that, since plagiarism is such a topical issue today, the 20th of December again arising from those congressional hearings. And but that seems to be a trajectory that Europe has been on. There's been these issues about how you accommodate Islam in the UK, in France, and in European societies more generally. Now, how do you accommodate Islam? Do you simply say, we're not going to discriminate against Muslims, which is something I agree with, of course? Or do you say, what we want is people asserting an Islamic identity? And once you move down that second path, what we really want is people asserting, prideful Islamic identities. You are then on the path of saying, and in doing so, they should be acting like proper Muslims. They shouldn't be going to nightclubs, etc., etc. At a larger level of abstraction, we're talking here about the accommodation of Islam in Europe, but at a larger level of abstraction, the more general issue is, do we say we're not going to discriminate against Group A, Group B, Group C? We're not going to discriminate generally against groups. We're going to be liberal in that sense. We're going to be non-discriminatory. All sorts of beliefs and ways of living are going to be tolerated in our society, and we're going to expect not just legal toleration but social toleration. That would be a liberal approach. The other approach is identity politics, where we say not just are we going to have non-discrimination, toleration even of things that we object to, we might not like some aspects of what Islam imposes on people in its morality, but we're not going to discriminate against Muslims. We may not agree with Islamic doctrine, but we're not going to try to suppress it. That's one approach. The identity politics type approach is to encourage a Muslim identity or a gay identity or some other kind of identity, and you then expect people will act in ways that conform to that identity, and any criticism of that identity is not tolerable. So that's the larger issue that arises out of that case in countries like France of how is Islam to be accommodated? It's not just Islam, it's a lot of other things as well. And is the accommodation going to be a kind of liberal style accommodation, or is it going to be a kind of accommodation based on this concept of identities and their valorization, or these identities being put forward as something that people are supposed to take pride in, and as opposed to
and this is not just members of the community
so
doing this. You're saying like this is the state that is giving that is like essentially defining what an appropriate gay person or appropriate Muslim believes and looks like and behaves.
Well, in some cases, yes. I mean, we've seen that with what community groups do. Do governments consult with, and they all have some concept of a community group perhaps being defined by religion, and so well, the people we're going to consult with will be perhaps the religious leaders of a certain community, even though there may be people in that community who actually dissent from from certain religious views or the views of those particular religious leaders. But it can then be very convenient to say, well, we, the government, really want to take into account, Muslim sensitivities, let's say. So we better go and consult with somebody. Well, who will we consult with? We'll consult with someone who seems to us like the paradigm of a Muslim leader, which is likely to be, in fact, some kind of religious figure.
Yeah, you talk about group polarization in your book,
Mm,
and again, I'm going to quote you for a moment, and you write, as a result, a roughly like-minded group will veer towards the most extreme, or, when viewed from the outside, implausible opinion to be found
mm,
within the
mm,
group before discussion and deliberation commence. In fact, the result may be a more extreme opinion than anyone in the group began with. And that sort of reminds me of groupthink, and that of how everybody who might not agree but just goes along because they don't want
mm.
to to be the only dissenter within a group, go along to get along. But I've always found that a fascinating dynamic because it contrasts with this other thing that I keep reading about, which is like the wisdom of crowds, or the slogan, "All of us are smarter than any of us." So how is it that we get?
Yeah.
So how is it that sometimes we humans think better in a group setting, and sometimes we think worse? And
Look,
it leads
yeah,
to instead of group dynamics leading to an accurate conclusion, leads to an extreme opinion.
yeah. The wisdom of crowds can work if you've got a crowd with a wide range of views in it, and there's a probability, with any random person that they're going to have some wisdom to contribute. You can set it up in such a way that when a crowd like that deliberates together, that they are more likely to reach a good outcome, correct outcome, than any one individual will do. But it has to be set up in the right way. With group polarization, what we find is you've got two quite different groups with quite different starting views. And within each of those groups, there'll be people with more extreme and less extreme versions of what defines the group. And you can get a dynamic, if it's set up in this way, where what's actually happening is that the members of the group are egging each other on, right? So you gain prestige by putting a view that's a more extreme version of the popular view within that group, which shows your commitment to the group's ideas. It shows that you can contribute by coming up with some new contrived argument, let's say. And you're likely to be applauded by putting that view that's actually more extreme than the view of the group. And the other group, the rival group that you're not talking to, is doing exactly the same thing. Now within those two groups in that model, you've got both groups acting with a dynamic where they're internally egging each other on, and they're becoming more and more extreme through processes of performance. So I'm in my little group that all believe much the same thing, and I can carry out a performance of loyalty and being a prototypical member of the group and making a contribution, and I carry that performance by saying something even more extreme than the general view within the group, but along the same lines, and I'm applauded for it. And the next person who sees that is motivated to do something similar. And before you know it, the group has moved perhaps even more to a view even more extreme than any one member you had at the start. And the other group, similarly divided, is doing the same thing. Now, those groups are set up quite differently from a larger group with diverse views. No one relatively extreme view that's committed to, and a lot of different wisdom among the people, such that they each actually do have something to contribute and are likely to make some contribution that contributes to solving the problem, whatever it is. So you have to set up that wisdom of crowds thing, with particular parameters, and you set up the group polarization thing, that disastrous outcome where two groups become more and more extreme and hate each other more and more, with a different set of parameters of how it operates. And unfortunately, in politics these days, what we're seeing is it's very often that second way, the group polarization mode of operation. The group polarization dynamic with increasing hostility between the groups.
Yeah, you wrote a couple of examples, and about what seems to be that dynamic at work, the like-minded people moving more and more extreme. There was the Christakis affair at Yale, and this was where somebody who wrote it, the administration wrote an email admonishing the students to be very sensitive and careful about the Halloween costumes that they
Yeah.
choose to wear that year. And Christakis wrote a reply saying, "Look, you know what? These are students, and they should make their own choices. And there should be some wisdom involved, but the administration needn't get involved." And they were hounded off of campus, and as a result. And there was another case that you mentioned where a gentleman by the name of Tim Hunt was excoriated online for something that he didn't even say, and lost his position at the University of College London as a result. Are these examples um, of group polarization, of people of like-minded just going more and more, taking the principles that they hold and going more and more extreme and being less and less tolerant? Or is there another dynamic at play for what seem to be fairly
Yeah.
egregious examples of shutting people down?
It's hard to know what the dynamic was with the Christakis case. So yes, the administration at Yale puts out this thing, admonishing students to be sensitive about what costumes they wear at Halloween. And Erica Christakis, who's she's got a position running one of the student residential colleges. She and her husband have those positions. She sent something out to the students saying, well, I think you can be sensible and so on, and I'm not going to tell you what to wear. It's a very conciliatory kind of email, which you think would not upset anybody, in fact. Now, presumably, as the students getting amongst each other discussing this, because that's where the backlash comes from. It's actually the students at the residential college that she and her husband are administratively in charge of, who then try to destroy the positions, that destroy I won't say the careers, because that's not quite accurate, but destroy the Christakises holding those positions. I can only assume that, yes, there must have been some dynamic if they got together and they discussed this and they outraged each other over what seems to be a pretty harmless group email that goes out from Erica Christakis. But the other part of the dynamic is simply that she said something that was taboo, because there is apparently this sensitivity about Halloween costumes that didn't exist in my time when I was a student. But the idea is, well, don't wear a Halloween costume that's going to be, cut across cultural sensitivities, right? Because we're now in a dynamic where identities matter so much. Causing hurt feelings by cutting across cultural sensitivities is now such a taboo in a way that it would not have been back in the 1970s, so when I was at university, that there's this kind of extreme reaction that I'm sure Erica Christakis would never have imagined could happen. I'm not sure exactly how old she is, but she would be a lot older than the students, perhaps a little bit younger than me, but not that much.
But might that increase
and
sensitivity?
So she's blindsided.
Might that increase sensitivity, like increased cultural sensitivity, be a good thing, like a sign of progress, that we're no longer running roughshod over other people's traditions and culture?
Look, I think some good sense is reasonable. Everyone now understands, okay, maybe there are some, some fairly extreme things that could be upsetting. Blackface.
Mm-hmm.
That would be a good example. Okay, we all now know that there's this history of blackface as a mechanism for mocking, Black Americans in particular, though it extends beyond the US. Everybody knows that now. But I think what Erica Christakis would say is, look, there are things that we all know, there's sort of egregious examples. We need to be a bit more trusting of young people. I mean, that's the irony, saying we need to be more trusting of young people. And we don't really need to to put out these notes to get them not to engage in sort of extreme, insensitive, costume wearing at Halloween. And if they make mistakes, if they get it a bit wrong and they cross a line, well, it's something to be talked about rather than something to lead to some strong response coming from the university administration. I think what she's saying there is pretty reasonable. We should perhaps be more trusting of young people, except ironically, it's the young people that then turn on her, and conduct what's basically a hate campaign against her and her husband, Nicholas Christakis. The other thing about it is when you look at the actual advice that went out, it wasn't saying, look, here are some well-known costumes that people have worn in the past that have caused a lot of upset. You delve into the detail of the advice and all kinds of costumes that you think, why is this upsetting? All kinds of costumes are being somehow seen as too insensitive. For example, you track through the various links in the email, and it turns out that there's something wrong with wearing a costume of Daenerys Targaryen. I need to pronounce that correctly. Daenerys Targaryen, the character from Game of Thrones. Now, I don't know what the sensitivity is supposed to be with wearing the costume of Daenerys Targaryen, right? But there must be some sort of sensitivity there. Or perhaps the people who put this email together didn't even look through their own links. I don't know. Who knows what was in their minds? But they've put out something that in itself is kind of extreme if you take it literally. So I see the point of her giving her the kind of response that she did as someone who's basically an expert in child development and, children morphing through adolescence into becoming young adults and so on, and thinking, well, maybe we should give them a bit more trust. But the point is, when they become very politicised, well, maybe you can't trust them not to turn against you.
And it seems to me that this is, like, we've been talking a fair amount about, I think, what most people will call the left on university campuses and so on. But there's also a lot from the right. I mean, at least in Canada and the United States under Canadian Conservative or U.S. Republican governments, there's actual government mandated censorship on what they consider to be sensitive topics. So there's the famous Florida "Don't Say Gay" laws. There's other states that have forbidden any state publication from mentioning rising sea levels or climate change at all. In Canada, under our previous Conservative government, any scientific findings had to be vetted by a political officer before they could be published. And similarly, all speeches to be made at scientific conferences, if you were a federal government scientist employee, had to be vetted by the government before you would be granted permission to speak. So there's a lot of restrictions on speech coming from both the left and the right. For those of us that think that free speech is worth defending and that it's a principle that who agree with Mill that we lose something every time speech is suppressed, where do we go from here? What actions can groups like the Centre for Inquiry Canada take?
Right. Well, the Centre for Inquiry can take up the cause. I mean, the Centre for Inquiry should be about free inquiry, right? It hasn't
Absolutely.
free
We're
inquiry.
doing our best here.
and, and I write a column for Free Inquiry, as you know. So Free Inquiry can take up this cause. It can review my book, I can do all sorts of things along those lines. I can take up the cause by writing books, writing articles, making public appearances. Not that I make that many. I'm grateful for this one. There are things like that we can do. We can encourage people to be a little bit braver. Sometimes in a group where everyone's being pressured to conform, there will be people there who don't actually agree but are afraid to speak their minds. Well, I'd encourage people just to look in the mirror every morning and say, well, I am someone who actually has views, and I'm the sort of person who wants to speak my mind, and not be afraid. Now, there's a limit to how far you can push that. If you're going to be in real danger of losing your job or worse, well, I'm not going to tell you to do something that I wouldn't do myself. But there are all kinds of small things that we can do every day if we start thinking of ourselves as that kind of person who does actually have views, who doesn't necessarily feel cowed to conform, and has something something valuable to put across. And we can think of ourselves as tolerant people who don't just join in every time there's a campaign against someone because they did something wrong. Like the Tim Hunt example, that was a good example that you brought up. Tim Hunt gave a humorous speech at a conference for academic leaders or academics, female academics. Was Women in Science, or a theme along those lines, in Korea. And apparently it was a well-received speech. But it was caricatured and misrepresented as a speech saying that women should be kept out of science labs because they create problems, because men will see them and will be distracted by their beauty or something along those lines. And it led to this campaign against Hunt, which was spearheaded by a Twitter hashtag, distractingly sexy. Okay, so we get, and so this huge campaign blows up against Tim Hunt, who said nothing like that. Now, he did tell some anecdotes about his own experience, meeting certain women, through his career and so on. But total misrepresentation of what he actually said. And the claim that it was badly received and so on was all apparently incorrect. It was well received by the women there who laughed at his attempt at humour. One thing we can do is not join in those kinds of campaigns against individuals attempting to destroy them. We can resist doing that, even though it's obviously very tempting for some people to do it. They see what seems to be a good cause. They think a way of promoting that cause, in this case feminism, I guess, they say a way of promoting that cause is to try to make life difficult for an individual who is seen as having transgressed. And they join this attack on the individual without ever looking at, well, what are the facts here? What would his side of the story be? I wonder what he really said. This seems too bad to be true. It's such a caricature of the traditional 1970s style male chauvinist pig. Was he really acting that bad? You might just reserve judgment a bit until you know a bit more. Yeah. And in any event, do we really want to pursue even good causes by just singling out individuals for destruction? That to me is not the way to go about it. That attack can just be cruel and disproportionate. So one thing we can do is try to find ways of pursuing our own good causes without that kind of rush to judgment, that kind of destroying individuals, disproportionately, do anything that they may have done wrong. We can try to pursue our causes through reason, for example, or even through group activities that may involve slogans and so on. I'm not saying we should have demonstrations, but you can at least show a little bit of care about what you're demonstrating. If you go to a demonstration in which you want to say Israel at the moment is carrying out this war against Hamas and the proto-state of Gaza, it's difficult carrying out that war because there's all this military or quasi-military infrastructure that's been built on or around populated areas, Gaza, etc., etc. But Israel needs to be damn careful here because even if it's targeting military sites, it's going to end up killing a lot of civilians. And we believe that Israel has been disproportionate in the way it's going about things, just targeting sites that it really doesn't need to target in the process, destroying all the civilian infrastructure, killing all these people. You can have all those views. But you shouldn't misrepresent what Israel's doing. Okay, so you can join with people to put a rational argument. You can even demonstrate. You can demonstrate for a ceasefire if you want to, I'm not saying you can't do those things, but you can try to reserve judgment. You can try to say, well, what is Israel really doing? Is it really committing genocide? Well, very unlikely that anything Israel's doing is meeting the definition of genocide. Was it committing genocide even before the atrocities of 7 October? Well, whatever it was doing wrong, it didn't amount to that. Is it running an apartheid state? Well, or maybe it is doing something a bit like that for security purposes on the West Bank. But Israel itself is certainly not an apartheid state. When you look at the facts, no, it's nothing like that. So let's not use that word, because it's an incredibly powerful word that, rouses people to anger, rouses people perhaps even to be willing to be violent, even violent against local Jews. Let's be careful about what language we use here. You can do all sorts of things to have a cause that you think is just and may actually be just, but doing so in ways that show the use of reason and which are not just targeting individuals and trying to destroy them, and they're not misrepresenting situations for whatever reason, out of ignorance because you're not prepared to actually do the work, or out of not really caring whether some of the things you're saying are right or not, as long as they contribute to the cause.
I personally fully endorse the proposal of fact-based, rational, and with a touch of humility, arguing with a touch of humility that you might not understand the full context or everything that's going on. I hope that more people can adhere to those principles that I'm seeing today. I could probably talk to you for another 2 hours. There's so much more that are in your books. We've barely touched on a few areas. I wanted to get into the role of religion in history and how much activities outside of one's work should affect your job or your conditions of employment. But we've been talking for nearly an hour and a half. So Russell Blackford, author of Freedom of Religion and the Secular State, The Tyranny of Opinion, and living in a post-liberal world. I'm sorry, how we became post-liberal. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. Any last thoughts you'd like to convey to our listeners? And if people want to learn more, they can read your books. And how do they find you online?
Oh, well, I'm easy to find online. Just search for my name and you'll find a somewhat up-to-date, somewhat not up-to-date website come up. But my books can be found on Amazon. They can be found at the publisher, which is Bloomsbury. You can find me on Twitter just by looking at my name, or Meta Magician is the tag that I use there. You can find me on Facebook. I'm pretty easily findable online, and the books are available from all of the places you'd expect. They're available from Amazon in Canada, for example, all of the English-speaking countries, US, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, India, the UK. My books are freely available from relatively large publishers. And that's about it, except to say that, look, I've enjoyed the conversation. That hour and a half went very quickly from my point of view. And we could doubtless talk about this a great deal more.
That I would love to have you back on to delve into some of these other issues that we didn't get to today in greater depth. So, Russell Blackford, thank you so much.
Thank you, Leslie.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Links for today's discussion can be found in the show notes. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please show your support at patreon.com/podcastforinquiry and give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. Email us podcast@centerforinquiry.ca. We'd love to hear your perspective. The Podcast for Inquiry is brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada. We are a national educational charity supporting reason, compassion, and secular values. Help us support rational discourse and evidence-based decision-making by becoming a member at centerforinquiry.ca/join. CFIC is on the web and Facebook and Twitter at CFI Canada. Podcast for Inquiry is produced and edited by Lee Shields, Zach Dumont, and Martin Zielinski. Music by Anthony Lazaro. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblood. See you next time.